Alright, YouTube, it's time to discuss why China will collapse. A lot of people in the United States, Europe, and so forth are worried, and a lot of people around China are happy to think that China is going to replace the United States somehow, that it will become the world superpower. Uh, I'm going to explain why that simply will never be the case, at least any time in the next 50 to 100 years. And it's simply how China has organized itself. When you look at China today, what you see, in essence, is a facade of great power. Behind that facade, though, there's a rot and decay and a lot of situations that have evolved in China that virtually preclude them from becoming more than a regional power. Nobody argues that China doesn't have a decent military. It's got a very large military, largely composed of poorly trained citizen irregulars, but nonetheless a massive military. They've got nuclear weapons. It would be fruitless for anyone to try to invade China. The only countries that could potentially do it would be the United States and Russia, using superior ICBMs and anti-missile systems and so forth. But China, beyond its military power, beyond its industrial power, really doesn't have a lot going for it. First, there's the population demographics. This is something that others have pointed out. China's population is going to bottleneck fairly badly in the next 10 to 15, maybe 20 years, as the period of extreme growth rates in China coincides with such a date that those individuals that create a massive, massive population are going to start entering old age. They're going to start leaving the workforce. They're going to start dying and retiring. The retirement leaving the workforce is actually worse for the Chinese economy than their eventual death, because you have a smaller proportion of people working in a much larger proportion of the population that will be drawing various subsidies from the government that will no longer be contributing to that labor. So the labor bottleneck in China is a fairly immediate threat to the country, especially since they've sort of scaled back that one-child policy, presumably in an attempt to prevent this from becoming a catastrophe by hoping that there will be teen and 20-something workers entering the workforce around that time. However, again, you look at a map of China, here's the other problem: their density. If you look at a map of China, a very large proportion of the entire land area of the country is covered by desert, inhospitable mountain, and in the case of Tibet, you have these rolling hills, these dryland hills of steppe. This land is not very good for agriculture. It doesn't have a lot of value. There are some mineral deposits, there are some fuel deposits, but you can't raise crops in the Gobi Desert. The population of China, which is massive, is largely crammed into about 50% of the country. Most of the population inhabits that eastern half in and near the coastlines and the southern borders, where it's more wet, there's more agricultural capability. But even if you look at the south of the country, there are still some steep ravines down there as well that basically limit agricultural development to these valleys in between these mountain ranges. Chinese agriculture, it is not clear, will actually be able to feed China. And they already import a large number of grains from Russia, from the United States, from parts of Africa, and they export a smaller amount of, but higher value products, things like tea, certain fruits, things of that nature. Also, China has already stripped a lot of its wood resources, which of course, in order to build buildings, you need some sort of material to build them. Wood is used in building structures. Where are they going to get it? They don't have any woodland. They've already developed almost every square inch of available agrarian land in their entire country. They do not have the capability to really expand their agriculture much, to feed an increasing population. Additionally, even more worrisome for China, the Chinese government has no problem with its citizens ingesting crops that are raised in smog-plagued areas that are full of heavy metals, potentially radioactive waste, and other chemicals and things that people don't generally want to ingest if they happen to live in the first world. They don't have a problem with that. There will come a point at which their extreme pollution which, by the way, now is far beyond levels ever seen, in Beijing specifically, far beyond levels ever seen potentially in any other city, including Industrial Revolution London or Boston or New York City, that's ever been seen in the world. This pollution, according to Russia Today, has poisoned 20% of the land area of China and 60% of the groundwater supply. People in this country, there are two problems from this. First, there will come a point at which this agriculturally fertile land is so polluted that the crops raised there will no longer be capable of being exported to countries that are willing to pay a decent amount for it. They'll end up having to export it either to other third world nations, or they won't be able to export it at all. That would be crushing for their economy. Look at all the tea that comes from China, all of these fruits and so forth. That's one problem. The other problem is what happens when their citizens continuously ingest the mercury and the arsenic and the lead and so forth, and start getting diseases. They've just admitted, by the way, that there are indeed what was termed by the West cancer cities in China. These are cities that are so heavily polluted, a large proportion of the population either has or will get cancer. We're talking about tens, possibly hundreds of millions of people. Otherwise healthy individuals who are breathing this smog and this coal dust and all of this carbon monoxide in, and they're fucking up their bodies continually. Because of their lack of environment, people say, well, China's leading the world in solar. That's great. The problem is their economy and their population is growing so quickly that the amount of solar and wind that they are developing is not even remotely enough just to keep up with their increased population. The pollution problem in China is getting worse and worse and worse. I can remember years ago when Beijing first started having this sort of ambient fog that rolls through every once in a while from all of these factories and plants. I can remember that. And they said, don't worry, outside world, we'll take care of the problem. And they bulldozed a bunch of stuff. They planted parks. They put solar up in the city. They started filtering some of the power plants that were nearby. And lo and behold, now, a decade later, it's gotten worse. That's because the population of this region, its power needs, its manufacturing needs, are all increasing. They can put up as many solar panels as they want, but they need to put up enough to support hundreds of thousands of new people every year just within its metro area. That's not even including dozens of other massive metropolitan areas all over China that haven't seen that level of solar and wind even put there, and haven't seen those controls put there because the media wasn't focused on them. So since their groundwater and now their land apparently is being poisoned, this poses a threat to the Chinese economy. Then there's power. China runs on coal. They've talked about solar and wind, and they've talked about gas being piped from Russia, and they've talked about all these things. That would be problematic, because in order to transfer to gas, they're going to have to bulldoze a bunch of coal plants, or they're simply going to be piping gas just to make up for the increased population every year. You're talking a growth of millions of people every single year. That's a massive, massive number of people. They don't have environmental regulations to help them. Now let's look at the manufacturing problem. Let's say the Western world falls into depression. Let's say the United States and Europe and Russia and all the other, Japan and South Korea, let's say that they all have varying degrees of depression next year. Let's say a world depression hits. What does this do to China? It puts virtually every Chinese citizen out of work, other than farmers that are increasingly being marginalized and pushed onto this poisoned land. Why? Because China's economy is almost entirely based, other than the resource extraction that they're developing and consuming internally, and their agriculture that they're consuming internally, most of their exports are cheap manufactured goods. Well, if the West isn't buying these manufactured goods, there goes about 10% of their entire workforce that's out of the job. Then you have separatists. You've got an increasing number of terrorist attacks in Beijing and elsewhere from these Muslim groups within the country that are becoming radicalized and saying, we want our own chunk of China. You've got Tibet, which is increasingly separatist and has been for decades. They don't like the mainland Chinese at all because they're ethnically different. Their economy is totally different. They're basically like Mongolians or the Nepalese. They just want to herd their goats and their cows and so forth and be Buddhists. They don't care about the central planning and the, all of the Maoist propagandist nonsense that goes on in China. Then you've got the problem of these remote areas, again, in the south and also north in the Gobi Desert, that have little or no military presence and could fly off at any time into riots and violence, because these people don't... If you look at China, here's a theory for you. If you look at China from Google Earth or any other satellite service, you'll notice a difference in the style of architecture. Now, in an anthropological, sociological way, you can tell a lot about a culture by the sort of buildings they're putting up. You look at mainland China, and you're seeing these high-rises, and it's all dusty colored because of all the smog anyway, but you see these sort of Soviet-era looking high-rises, and you look and you see sort of a cohesive society. All the roofs are the same color and so forth. You look at the south of the country, and it looks a little bit almost European from the sky. You see sort of an intrusion of aberrant architecture that probably the Maoists and groups like that would frown upon. You see roofs painted different colors and little home gardens and so forth. You look at the steppe and you can tell it's like a totally different country. Another myth about China is that it's some sort of homogenous group, like you're Chinese, you're a Chinese as an ethnicity or something. There are dozens and dozens of different groups that make up the population of China. That's the reason for this separatism. The people that are living sort of in Inner Mongolia, or they're living in the steppe out in Tibet, are not ethnically the same, not religiously the same, really not culturally the same as the mainland Chinese, just like the Taiwanese. Taiwan is independent from China. China still claims it, but it's backed by the United States, so they can't do anything about it. They don't want to be part of China, and look at their economy. It's far better than that you see anywhere in China other than a few very developed areas. I would theorize that in the future, China will also have a problem with some of its mainlanders, with some of the people in the wealthier metropolitan areas, the investors, sort of the white-collar class, the upper management, people like that have extra spending money and they've generally been treated well. They're living in these metro areas that are increasingly polluted. You see these people break free in some cases from authoritarianism. They go and they visit the Western world and they see how it is. And a lot of these people take those ideas back to China. Now, there are already thousands of people in China, probably millions of them, working underground for Christian organizations and Muslim organizations and liberation movements and capitalist movements and all of these things. Eventually, these groups will either consolidate and probably overthrow the government, or there's going to be increased separatism there as well. They'll want reform or separation. In either case, it would throw China into havoc, because again, you've got this massive land area. If any sort of unrest of a significant nature affects the coastal Chinese areas where all of these manufacturing outlets are, very quickly you'll probably see Tibetan separatists and Muslims rise up and essentially begin beating on what little military presence there are in these areas. And you'll see them split potentially off of China, because you'll see worldwide condemnation of their actions when they do roll in and they start killing people. Either that or China becomes isolated and their economy gets crushed anyway. Also, North Korea. Kim Jong-un executed the Chinese puppet that was probably really in charge of what was going on in North Korea. It's tenuous at best that North Korea will remain a Chinese asset. They could go completely rogue, in which case China will probably be forced to go to war with them and annex them entirely, which would not sit well with the world. And then there'd be separatists there as well. Or China will be forced to cut a deal with the West, essentially handing over North Korea to the Western fold in exchange for continuing to trade these goods. Also, you've got to understand something. China operates, the reason why it's so cheap to get goods there, on basically underpaying the laborers and barely paying what we would consider median income to even their upper management, and using brute labor. Their technology is in the 1970s. In some fields, it's even worse. They built an aircraft carrier. They sailed it out into the ocean. It very quickly developed problems and had to be put back into port for months for maintenance on their first aircraft carrier. They do not field a modern military. They do not field a modern technological equivalent to the manufacturing abilities of the United States and Europe and South Korea and Japan and Australia and New Zealand. They're on par, almost, with Mexico or Brazil when it comes to their technological capabilities. They're behind countries that we consider marginally third world. They're behind these countries. There's also another problem for China, and that's this. Because China has such a capability to utterly collapse at any time, let alone that their currency's gone down, they've got ghost cities all over the place. There's the pollution, the separatists, the rise of these sort of liberation groups that want an open internet for China, that want Chinese capitalism. There are environmental concerns. There are a host of problems in China. The Western world is not blind to this fact. To the Western world at large, Russia is a gas pipeline, and China is a manufacturing center that also exports agricultural goods. They are utterly expendable in the mind of the first world countries. They are utterly expendable. All of these ideas about BRICS are nonsense. Brazil is about to have its own problems. Although, I'll give Brazil credit, they've done a lot better than China, and they probably will in the future. They haven't even developed all of their agricultural land, so they'll keep growing. Mexico, South Africa could grow if it weren't for separatists again, and all of these militant groups and all the racial infighting. India, I believe, is the next Asian superstar, which will carry the banner of Western manufacturing. The reason why is this. India has a more swiftly growing population. India is more friendly to the Western cause. It is less oppressive. It would really, I think, for the Western world, be better to pay a little bit more for Indian manufacturing in order to eliminate the Chinese ability to compete with the world and throw them into chaos and hopefully let them balkanize in order to get some reforms and then do, again, business with China after it feels that pain. I think it would probably be better, and I think there are those who probably agree with me, to pay a few cents more per item and pay India more and prop up their economy to draw India into the Western fold. The only reason I believe that that hasn't already been done is China's ability to screw with UN councils and the fact that it has nuclear weapons. But again, if it feels this pain and begins to balkanize, it's not clear they'll be capable of continually fielding that many nuclear weapons. And it's still a fairly, compared to Russia or the United States, they've got peanuts as far as military technology goes. The United States and Russia share a sort of bilateral view of the world. The United States, of course, is partnered with NATO, giving it the top spot for power, and Russia is partnered loosely with the Chinese, which gives it an equalization to NATO. The problem being the Chinese and Russians hate each other and only work together diplomatically because they see the West as a greater threat to their ability to compete in the world. It's essentially politics making strange bedfellows. But China's economy has not been developed to the extent that it needs. I think what China wanted to do after the Gang of Four and after sort of move towards capitalism and being content with being a regional contender and maybe grabbing a little bit of land but not really being concerned with, a commie takeover for the world, and they sort of shoved that aside. I think China really wanted to become the industrial superpower of the world because they figured if they began industrializing heavily and producing quality goods, they could force out not only the United States, but the Japanese, the Korean, even the Russians, and probably would become an equal superpower to the United States or Russia, perhaps even surpass them. All this talk about the Chinese economy is going to become larger than that of the United States. That's just great. The problem is they rely entirely on the United States and its allies to import Chinese goods. So if the United States goes down the tube, half of China becomes unemployed overnight, and they end up getting crippled. They would no longer be powerful. The United States would do fine, even in isolation, producing its own goods. China has to import its coal from Africa now. It even imports coal from the United States. It imports grain from the United States. It imports raw iron from the United States. It imports European parts for some of its more important power needs in these power plants that it tries to maintain. Some of these things date to the 60s and 70s. All this talk about China becoming the next world power is ridiculous. If I would think India would be a more likely contender for the next world power based on its industrial scale than China. India has a better chance of eventually overtaking the United States and Russia than China does. Especially if it were to wipe out Pakistan and take over that land, then it probably would. China doesn't have that capability. They've gone too far down the rabbit hole of manufacturing goods that leave it completely at the mercy of the markets in the Western world. Well, if it starts to displace the same people it's selling a quarter of its goods to, and those economies begin to shrink on fear that China's taking over, China shrinks itself. It's almost a parasitic relationship when you really think about it. To the Chinese, the only thing that they're getting in return is the fact that they can employ several 100 million people in these manufacturing plants, which, by the way, rely almost entirely on US and EU investments. Europe and the United States are the ones that are pumping money, and Japan to a lesser extent, are pumping money into China. What they do is they go in, they build a factory, or they, lease one that's already been built but's been vacant, and they put people to work manufacturing shitty, cheap goods to re-import to the United States. And they become cheaper than U.S. manufactured goods because you're paying them about 1/10 of what you would pay U.S. workers. They do this in India and Malaysia and Thailand and other places as well. Indonesia and Bangladesh, all of these places, Pakistan, even like Egypt, and parts of North Africa. The problem being, if the U.S. investors leave, then the factories begin to go broke because there's no longer anyone to pay these. The government of China is incapable of paying that many people, and they go out of work. Then the Chinese have to pay these workers or watch them be homeless, rolling around in the excrement and not eating and beginning to starve off. The Chinese economy has been structured in such a way that it has almost become a diplomatically opposite but economically a vassal state to the Western world. Interesting book by Friedman. I haven't read it, but I've seen the synopsis and in discussions with others revealed more about this work, claims that within the next 20 or so years, China will collapse and potentially balkanize. I happen to agree. All of the stages are set for China to go from a regional power to an utterly backwards, it's sort of like the last great famines in China. In the 80s, sort of when the Chinese began migrating to the United States because their home country was falling apart, we could see that again. Only this time they probably won't find anywhere to let them migrate to. They'll just simply start starving and their population will be cut by a quarter or so. China, I believe, will collapse and balkanize within the next 10 to 15 years, maybe 20. Within my lifetime, assuming I don't get, in a car wreck or something, I expect to see China balkanize. Because, again, the stage is set for that. Also, there's the possibility that even though Asian culture is based around making vague threats, sort of based in egotism to your enemies and competitors, we see this with these Japanese islands. The Chinese have no intention, I believe, of attacking Japan and attempting to occupy these islands because, again, the Japanese are fully backed by the United States, and we would end up going into a nuclear war with them. I think they understood. They're not stupid. Asian cultures, I hate to be stereotypical, I'm saying Asian governments, the way that they traditionally run, is to make these vague threats to others, to sort of go wink wink, we could invade you and destroy you if we wanted to, we're not going to do that, but we want you to sort of get worried, and we want your allies to be worried. That's what they do. North Korea does this almost weekly, and you see it with South Korea doing it towards the north, and towards China and Japan. You see this in Vietnam. You see this in all of these countries. They continually do this to one another, because that's how they've operated for thousands of years. China will not do that, though. China should be concerned with growing its own economy. Instead, they're making these threats to appear sort of dominant to their own people, to sort of prop up their egotism. That's just what they do. China, if anything, in any World War scenario, would either stay out of it utterly or snipe some of the sort of unaligned states south of it. They might go after like Taiwan or Vietnam or something, or they would join the side of the West. Because even though they diplomatically ally with the Russians, sort of to keep one of their major trading partners that happens to share a border with them from, getting mad at them and not giving them fuel resources, they do a lot more trade with the Western world. And I think they understand their economy is tied to the existence of the Western world as the dominant superpower. As for the Russians that everyone's worrying about displacing the Western world, it isn't going to happen either. Because if you look at the structure of their economy, it's sort of similar. Again, they're using outdated technology in a lot of their factories and so forth, not through any fault of their own, not through any fault of the policies they have in place currently, but simply because for so long, and you see this in Eastern Europe as well, they were under communist rule. And it crippled their economies. They only barely, in the 70s and 80s, began to mechanize their farming techniques. They are decades behind the Western world in their technology. They don't frack the same way we do. They don't extract their resources as efficiently. Japan, by the way, is poised to perhaps crush the economy of China even further and put North Korea into an out-and-out famine by extracting this mineral sludge that's clustered around some of their uncontested islands using a vacuum hose and a ship. If they begin to do that, well, the North Koreans and Chinese are blowing holes in the hillsides trying to extract these minerals. The Chinese can extract them at about half the cost by simply sucking them up as sludge off of the ocean floor. It might be the largest rare earth mineral deposit on the face of the earth, except for the ones in North Korea. If that happens, there goes a few percentage points off the Chinese and North Korean economies that will be quite harmful. China, I do not believe, will become dominant. In fact, if anything, I see them sliding backwards within the next decade or two. And it's simply a function of their culture, regardless of the facade they put on for the outside world. Again, because they're closed off from the outside world, partially, it's difficult for Westerners to get a view of them, but we can still understand their economy. And as for these numbers of their economic growth and all of their credit and all of their wonderful manufacturing, again, they manipulate their currency. They manipulate their markets. They manipulate their growth statistics. And these ghost cities and these smog-filled cities and these continuous separatist attacks make it look like a lot of this may even just be an illusion. Like this growth may not even exist, and they're putting these numbers out primarily to keep investors there and keep them from flocking to Bangladesh and India and Pakistan and Thailand and Vietnam. I think if the Western world understands these facts about China, what they should be doing is moving their investments, not all at once, because then you have an out-and-out collapse, and you would have potentially China getting desperate and attacking people. Slowly transition those investments and those factories to these other Asian countries, and give them that business. It will cost slightly more. However, then, you have the possibility, imagine the possibility, of taking India, which is sort of neutral and sort of plays both sides, imagine taking them into the Western sphere. Imagine grabbing up Pakistan at the same time with manufacturing jobs. It would be a wash for these people in Russia and China who are desperately clinging to this delusion that they are going to become more powerful. The Western world has that power simply through technology. Now, I'm not like dick-wagging for the United States. I'm saying the Western world, which includes, by the way, states that aren't as friendly with the United States anymore as they used to, primarily because of things like the NSA and the continual warmongering that we've been doing since Bush was elected, and continued through Obama. What we should be doing is, of course, repairing those relations and sort of solving our own problems before we continue to attack these countries. But no, I don't believe China essentially looks like a paper palace, or a house of cards, to me at least. I don't think we're going to see the day in our lifetimes where China becomes dominant. In fact, again, what I expect to see is them balkanizing. Once they do, they will no longer be a contender for becoming a world power, because they will have lost a substantial proportion of their land area and thus their economy, their population, their ability to field a military. If just the Mongolian region and the Tibetan steppe were to secede from China, their density also would go through the roof, again because of the density of this like eastern, roughly 1/3 of the country that's not part of those two areas. I think you would see their economy shrink substantially. It would be crushing for China, and that, again, is what I expect to see. That's about all. Peace out.